How many of you have used what? Claude, Gemini, ChatGPT, DeepSeek? What did I forget? There's so many. Just this week alone. Forget all those other days. Okay. So when you create content with GenAI and you use this content, do you say you created it or did you get help from AI? Do you say it is AI generated or you say it is me generated? And another question for you guys, if you use GenAI and you are the tech lead of a company and it gives you an idea or you use this idea and it costs the company $1 million, who is responsible? Is it the AI? Is it the prompt engineer? Is it the developer? And why is it the AI? Who is accountable? See, this is one of the ethical issues that I would like us to discuss. Actually, Michelle, let me just start with you. Who would be responsible in such a case?
Definitely not the AI. There's no, I guess because there's no law that puts the blame on the tool, the blame will fall on the user. There's something that, what do they call it? There's a tool, there's a word that they use that says the manufacturer will be responsible because of how they built the thing, like how this vehicle manufacturers, like Volkswagen had that case and all this, and you do the vehicle recalls and you're the ones who get fined. Who's finding other organizations, like the people who make hammers? When someone uses a hammer on an animal or on a person as opposed to on a nail, it's not, you don't recall the hammer. So because there are very few laws for that, the blame squarely goes to the end user.
My primary school teacher used to say, a poor workman blames his tool. Yes. So, Mutembe, you're working on what is like Africa's first DeepSeek AI. Yeah, right. So what is that experience like for you? How do you embed ethical AI in it in the first place? And secondly, what are some of the lessons you're taking from how the world is responding to DeepSeek right now? Yeah.
Okay, one is that it's also very interesting how now the conversation has moved from, building an open AI to now everybody is saying you can build your own DeepSeek, right? Somehow China, whether it's CCP or it's DeepSeek, the company, made people realize that, this is not longer like an exclusive club, right? Of people who only have, $500 billion, right? To be able to build something. And, that's always been the idea, you can build in scarcity. Now, I think for a long time, it's not new, the kind of risks and ethical thinking that people are, thinking about. There's a researcher, I think she's called Timnit. She used to be head of, safety and AI at Google for a long time until they actually kicked her out because she was mentioning that the existential things that people have been thinking about, sort of the Terminator idea of what AI is, that's a bit far off. We've always had these other challenges where, for example, I think it was in 2020, 2019, where, Google's model where it takes your Google photos and it automatically labels them, right? At that time, because of lack of representative training data, it was labeling black faces as gorillas. Right. And so that's already one where like those are already biases, like those are already risks that were already there. For example, in the US for the security agencies at some point were using facial recognition for crime fighting, like, trying to identify who's a suspect. And then unfortunately, most of the images that they used for convicts, because most of their prisons are full of like, African Americans, then it would end up picking someone as potentially being, a criminal based off of color. So the conversation about existential risks, is there's those ones which are really far off, like, a doomsday potential, and really small ones as, being declined for credit. right? So right now, for a lot of people, they don't have enough data because, for example, for Africans, because we are not that banked. So if you go online and try to, for example, even today, this was happening to us. Like when you're trying to use an African, prepaid card on a lot of platforms, it will decline because it just doesn't have enough experience. The model doesn't have enough experience of knowing that, okay, there's people in Africa that are paying for cloud using these cards, right? Or in the US, people are using these cards mostly for getting drugs or crypto on the dark web, but then it'll still factor in and think that Africans are that. So for us, what we've always been thinking about since the beginning is one, where do we get the data? How do we get representative enough data? How do we get data that's diverse enough, right? I know right now there's been the whole backlash of diversity and inclusion in the US, but the reality is that AI is pretty much data. And if you don't feed it with enough representative data, it makes mistakes such as those ones where it was thinking that, Africans are gorillas because it hasn't seen who they are. And then also these things of now trying to figure out the decisioning of the AI system, why it's making a certain decision. I think at one point there was an AI system that they were trying to figure out how it could tell male versus female, right? And I think in the US, they realized that it was picking faces not based on certain unique features, but it was on makeup. Then they brought it like to rural Africa, where people are not using a lot of makeup, and the model wasn't being able to tell the difference really well. So even like the ability, the decisioning and knowing why it's making a decision based on what data that it's actually looking at, that's one of the things that we've always looked at. How do we actually collect enough and representative data? Because a lot of times people will think that, you're building a model, you don't need that much data. But if you're looking at the African scenario, is we actually don't produce as much data on the internet, right? Right now, I just saw like there's a friend, I think from Sweden, who we met a couple of years ago, and they are still asking whether Lamu was safe. Because the data that's there on the internet right now, that, web crawl is this, most of these AI companies used a system called, web crawler, where they'd been putting a lot of data from across websites around the world. But if you look at the internet and try and look at how much data is actually produced from Africa, so most of what's online even about Kenya, you still think things about hotels, like Kenya as being unsafe, and that's how these systems have been trained. So this is still what they know. And so for us, it's always been thinking about how can we use the limited amount of data, maybe create some synthetic data from the African continent, but also it means that we are not as lucky as, for example, China, where the CCP probably has data for everybody, right? And already has put it in certain systems, but we actually have to go out and, continuously continue collecting data. Because think about, Michael was talking about languages earlier on, right? And asking different languages. Even our own data about our own languages. It's not, you go out 20 kilometers out of Nairobi and further, people are still speaking in the vernacular. Right? There's so much content that needs to be codified in our local languages, which has not been codified.
Okay.
Right? And so that's also how we're thinking about it. How do we also collect this local language data and actually use that also to build models? But also what that does is that the way language structure is not the same in every country. So even the way you're building your generative AI models that are NLP based, right? You realize that whatever scientists and computer scientists and linguists have built in the US is not going to be the way we build here. So even the tools are still not available. So we find ourselves having to build our own tools from the scratch, working with linguists from, whether it's Maseno, people like Dr. Wanzale and others, right? We actually need to come up with these things ourselves.
Okay, I guess that answers the question. Is it possible to build a DeepSeek in Africa? Yeah, I saw you nodding quite a bit to what Mutembe was saying. What are the ethical implications of what he just said? Why should we care about inclusivity and diversity? Why do we need that context? Why do we need that nuance? How will it help with the data sets? Yeah.
So I know the DEI conversation is a bit political right now with Trump, and Elon Musk pushing against it. But there's an aspect here that we are not having a conversation on. And we talk about AI being leveraged in businesses to make more money or to become more efficient. There's an aspect of social good that we haven't even touched yet, right? Communities that are underserved, medicine and healthcare that doesn't reach the village level because they can't afford the medicine that someone in Nairobi is able to afford. Those conversations are important. And the aspect of inclusivity essentially says that the whole world has a representation of so many other people. There are rich people, there are poor people, there are people who can actually afford something, there are people who cannot. We need to be able to include those people into the conversation. Because if we don't, what ends up happening is we have the power and the privilege and the profit and the benefiting that happens around leveraging AI. The people who can leverage that, they get to do that. And then we have this underserved community that will never have access to the benefits of AI. What are we going to do about that? And I think that's the conversation here. And the inclusivity conversation essentially means let's bring those people into the fold. So when AI is benefiting people in towns, people who can afford it, we need to also think about the underserved communities. How can they as well benefit from what comes out of this AI revolution?
Okay. And Mercy, you work with a lot of creatives who generate content. So when it comes to AI generated content, how do you handle issues like copyright, IP, and how can CIOs learn how to extrapolate that into their own Gen AI experiences? Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think as much as you want to assume AI has become the new electricity, and as much as you want to push it aside and act like it's something that's not with us, the AI winter has ended and people are starting to embrace AI, even in the creative industry. So most people are actually becoming aware of AI, its uses, and incorporating it into their daily lives, especially in the creative industry. And most people are now trying to work with AI, not as a tool, but as an assistant. So we as creative organizations and creative industry, we are trying to help them understand their copyright rights. That is with Kekobo and NGOs and organizations that are in the creative industry, by educating them. Most people don't actually know their IP rights as the creatives, and that's something I think we have been trying to incorporate, from webinars to workshops to trainings that help them understand, hey, I'm an artist, I'm using this AI to help me do the art, but these are my rights and these are the boundaries that I can't cross. And then we're encouraging transparency, because now with AI, everybody will, this is my art, this is my book, this is what I've done. But have they even verified that the data they are actually releasing out there is something that has not been done by someone else in the past? So license, we are trying to encourage the creatives to actually work with licensed data. That is, before you release something out there, as much as it's creative, and people are actually now making even music through AI. There's the Ben Guy, the guy that was released, a singer, but I would say a singer, an AI singer. So out there, people are actually trying to do something in the creative industry. So we're encouraging learning and understanding, because now you can't work with someone who doesn't understand what they're doing. So understanding their copyrights, rights, as well as boundaries, as well as transparency among us themselves, and working with licensed data. Before you release anything out there, verify it to know that it's okay and that no one else has actually taken that same project.
So I know that there's this new concept that GPT is introducing, which is a reasoning capacity. So Michelle, there isn't a lot of transparency in how AI arrives at a thought process or at a decision. So if a CIO is using generative AI, how can they explain the thought process behind the data that they're presenting to the board?
That's a tough one, but so ChatGPT has its own reasoning model, and it shows some of the steps.
Yeah.
And for their own reasons, they don't show everything. DeepSeek shows everything in terms of each of the steps taken. The thing, no, and that's the reasoning outputs. That's the output after it's done. It's gone through different computations. It's not why it chose that particular computation. So there's a part within models that's called an MLP, multi-layer perception. Within that layer of the neural network, a lot of mess happens. And then, so what we are having with all these models is, the larger the model gets, the harder it is to understand that part. The only way to, as a CIO, to say, well, I use ChatGPT, and this is the strategy it wrote for us, and this is why it makes sense, is that you have the answer. Now you have to work backwards from, now you have to validate what ChatGPT has given you as an output. Because trying to get every source that it used is difficult. There's an example on YouTube of how a model decides to draw, an AI model. And I think I'm trying to remember, I'll try to remember who posted it, but it's some researchers. And they found out when it was asked to draw, for example, a chair, it'll look at even dogs, elephants. It'll look at every image, any image it comes across, as it slowly then starts to draw the chair. So it starts, a chair has 4 legs, so does a dog. So it's also looking at dogs and cats. It has a backrest, maybe that's a giraffe. It starts drawing a neck of a giraffe and starts morphing. Eventually it ends up with an image. That entire process, they were able to see how that process happened. What is a challenge of the black box is why it chose that path. So why did it choose to go that way within the network? Because within the MLP, it can hit different, that's multiplication of the matrices could be, it could multiply at the top and find an answer without having to go through the entire network. And that's what, so the speed also, that also factors into how good certain models are. Some models are very specialized that they'll compute very little. So they'll walk, your answer will be computed across a very small portion of the network and back to you. That allows for some transparency of how and where it went and how it decided. The bigger the model, the harder it is. But I always just say, get your answer from ChatGPT or whichever model, work backwards trying to break it. Scientific principle says if someone comes up with a theory, it's my job, who doesn't believe it, to disprove it. So when ChatGPT gives you an answer, try to disprove it. If you can't disprove it, tell your bot to also try and disprove it. You tell them it's rock solid. This was the strategy. I've worked it backwards. If we do this in 5 years and these things remain constant, we're the best.
Okay, so Amrit, you actually have a master's in blockchain technology, which means you studied blockchain before it became cool. So I have 2 questions for you. One is, how can blockchain help creators prove that they created their own AI-generated content? And how can it be used on a larger scale to ensure compliance with AI regulations?
Yeah, thank you. So to your first question, and I touched this briefly, there's a paper that I referenced during the CI 100 event, and I at the time I forgot what it was, but it was actually by the International Association for Trusted Blockchain Applications. So if you look at the fundamental characteristics of a blockchain, what is it? It's about building trust using certain capabilities that the blockchain is able to offer you. And those fundamental characteristics essentially touch on security, immutability, being able to timestamp it, and thereby then being able to prove the origination of a data set. So it's basically just a block. Now, what we are seeing more and more, and this is across different use cases, different industries, finance, manufacturing, supply chain management, which is one of my personal favorites, what you can effectively do is create similar to what an NFT is, and that NFT then belongs to the holder of the record, which is essentially a token. So if I want to prove ownership of a certain element, which has been tokenized, essentially what you're doing is digitizing a physical asset into the virtual world and being able to track it throughout its life cycle using that token, which you are then the holder of certificate for. So for verifiability, which then also generates trust, if I want to know the creator of this piece of art, this piece of music, for example, as you've rightfully stated, that can then be put onto the blockchain, and the blockchain, through propagating it through whatever distributed network it is on a peer-to-peer network, which fundamentally should not be controlled by any one single entity, right? That creates a lot of functionality that can generate the element of trust. So from that perspective, the blockchain has become so fundamentally embedded in discussions around AI, in discussions around transparency. But for me, again, the whole concept of ethics rests on the foundation of trust. How do I build trust? And these are the fundamental characteristics of blockchain that allow me to do that. To your second question, that's still a big debate, because the whole issue around scalability of the blockchain has been a conversation. Why? Because all the stakeholders across the value chain have not been able to come up, if I could call it, a single standard that they could adhere to. So there are different blockchain networks that are running for various use cases, etc. For me, JP Morgan is always a good example. JP Morgan have developed something internally for themselves, which they use for, I believe it's cross-border transaction settlements. But they had to develop it for themselves and then integrate other stakeholders into it. When we look at the scalability aspect, it's still something that is in discussion just because of that. There's some projects which unfortunately failed at the POC stage. So this continues to be a work in progress. I'm sure there will be a solution very soon, especially now with the development. If I could give you a simple example of stablecoins. So USDT as one of the stablecoins is being used very commonly across many, many regions in the world, and specifically around transaction settlements. Why does that create trust? Is because, again, the fundamentals are good. So stablecoin means I will have in custody something which allows me to hold, let's say, for example, $1 versus one coin, or some grams of gold versus one coin, etc. Those are the kind of projects that I believe will help us gain the scalability that you've asked about.
Okay. Wow, where did everyone go? Do you guys have any questions? Any questions? No questions. You're all fine with generative AI. You can prompt the hell out of it. You can, deliver. You can make business decisions, solid outcomes. No questions? All right, then. Well, thank you, guys. Thank you so much.